if you would, that will provide us some confirmation that you're paying attention, you're learning, and give us a sense of what the level of knowledge is regarding this subject.
And we'll have our feedback questions at the end.
That is correct, Steve. All right, with that, we commence. And the title of today's webinar is Tile Drainage, the Watershed, and the Environment. An alternate, perhaps catchy title.
The green practice.
Yes, it's green according to the font color I've chosen. I would like to think that at least some, if not all, the information today will provide the participants in the webinar to draw at least some preliminary conclusions about the, let's call them the potential implications of tile drainage when it comes to the environment. Could be environmental impact, but on the other side there could be some benefits as well. So stay tuned for that, folks.
And remember, all our webinars are put together so that if you're new, you're learning, and if you're experienced, hopefully we'll teach you something new. So take it away. Oh my gosh, that's a heck of a picture there.
For those of you who may not be familiar with the concept of the non sequitur, which I believe is Latin, anywho, this is something that a certain conservation district manager will recognize right away. After I used this shot at the Fargo Land and Water Conference of the Red River Basin Commission. This is to make sure you're paying attention out there in webinar land and to give you pause to think about the other possibility. Even though tile drainage and our various crises of late have focused our minds on excess water, we need to keep in mind that with a potentially changing climate, and even barring that simple weather variability during a growing season, farmers need to prepare for drought as well as flood.
And remember, that's not one of those questions of where's Waldo. This is actually mentioned as sunglasses. So.
No mystery there. Yeah, I'm sure I'm fairly recognizable. That was, yes, a little foray to Morocco where they have, they've got water concerns of a very different kind right there, as you can tell. So, in terms of some introductory and concluding comments or key messages, here's what I'd like you to chew on throughout the presentation, I suppose. First of all, agricultural drainage will happen in one fashion or another, and that's because Agri-Manitoba, the Great Plains region, is a region dominated by agriculture, and the reason it's been colonized and is producing economic activity is agriculture. And how was that made possible over a lot of those lands? It's through improvements in drainage. So this is not to let the farmers off the hook. Of course, there are concerns associated. However, we have to recognize that if the farming's already happening on a piece of ground, introducing tile drainage may not be creating new problems because the so-called problem already existed. So we have to at least accept that as a key concept from the get-go, and maybe think more about what is an optimal situation as opposed to the ideal, and what practices can give us a net benefit. We need to make proper comparisons before either favoring or condemning a practice. And that means tapping into appropriate scientific knowledge and, of course, keeping an open mind and being a bit critical when reading articles or taking the opinions of others. Opinions are welcomed, but we need facts, and in order to make a critical assessment, we have to make sure we're doing the quintessential apples versus apples as opposed to apples and oranges comparison. So I'll elaborate on that later. And finally, consider carefully what is needed before taking the plunge in terms of farmers as far as adoption of the practice. But with a lot of you other folks on the line today, I'm referring to rules or recommendations. So that's a message to regulators of various types and folks like me who work in extension. Thus, here we are at part one, setting the broader context for examining the environmental implications of tile drainage. So we're going to do some digging here into some good nerdy details, but first, again, broader context means we've got to make sure we're on the same page in terms of where we're at in the Great Plains region. And for a kid who was inspired by David Suzuki, and in part, he deserves credit for me being here. I have come to take on a more balanced view than I had in my youth.
So hence the sunglasses, right?
Yes. No rose-colored glasses, no pounding of the table. Why isn't the government just fixing this? Well, it isn't all down to the government to do it in a province like ours, in a region like ours. And secondly, we have to accept that these are not ecosystems that we're attempting to manage. They are agri-ecosystems. So that is to say that farmers have not abandoned Mother Nature. Au contraire, they are dependent on Mother Nature for the natural resources that allow them to produce crops and livestock for economic activity and to feed the world. And so these landscapes that farmers are managing have been altered from the natural. Farming can have impacts, but because of the reliance on natural resources, farmers have a vested interest in protecting those resources. Farmers manipulate water through various management techniques, as is obviously the subject of today's webinar with tile drainage. As well, farmers add inputs in the form of nutrients, control weeds with pesticides, and so forth. And therefore, the system is not natural. So we have to keep that in mind when we're taking a hard look at a practice like tile drainage. This is, like, as they say, not to let anyone off the hook or simply to adopt a practice because it's cool and will generate revenue for the farmer. No, we realize that has to be a careful, balanced approach. But we have to recognize that, for instance, in the prairie pothole country, as you can see on the screen right now, this is not an unaltered landscape. It's already been changed. So now we have to ask ourselves what additional manipulations are justifiable to mitigate any impacts that agriculture may be having and to enhance what farmers can do on the landscape, whether it's in prairie pothole country or the Red River Valley, for instance.
I think that was a great picture when you give consideration to the lay of the land on our great flat prairies, all those little cups sitting around. We talked before about the need of LIDAR, and I think there's justification if we're going to look at water retention and the combination of retention and tile drainage, we need the right tools to do it. So,
excellent point, Steve. Yes, good time to bring up the need for LIDAR. So further to this big picture talk before we get into the nitty-gritty, I simply want to put forth a few thoughts of a philosophical nature, I guess, and they do provide, I believe, a good context for examining tile drainage for its environmental sustainability and its potential benefits in terms of environmental stewardship. So in considering the variability of our landscape, it seems to me that we have some choices to make. And these are some of them on the screen here for you to chew upon. And it might depend on your individual perspective as to which one you happen to favor the most. But what I want to draw most attention to are what I might call the gray areas in between the prime land with no limitations and the land that is really not suitable for intensive agriculture, or what the hockey fans out there might refer to as the soils on a bubble. Will these kids make the team or not? Same kind of idea. These soils may or may not make the big time, and it may be that excess moisture is what's holding them back. How do we make a correction sustainably to address those? It relates well to enhanced efficiency fertilizers if we're talking about nitrogen risk. There are new techniques and technologies for farmers to consider. We have to look with clear eyes at what the potential benefits are and the potential drawbacks.
To take a look to see if the value is there in order to maintain or to get the potential out of that field.
Precisely. Further, our Premier provided fairly recent context here back in mid-January around the time of the Red River Basin Commission Land and Water Conference in Fargo. By coincidence, the Premier was with the Minister of Agriculture at Ag Days and maybe surprisingly to some, to many, chose to announce at least some preliminary concepts regarding the green plan for the province and in particular water management. So I've made a few highlights for you on the screen in terms of the press release, and I'll come back to this later simply to provide some context to today's examination of tile drainage and related water management practices. And as I try to point out at each of our extension events, this is a multidisciplinary subject. We need, therefore, experts and specialists from these various disciplines And that's definitely our approach through Manitoba Agriculture, inside and outside of the department. And yes, big picture, what is the alternative to tile drainage? Let's keep in mind that the water needs to go somewhere, and presumably on reasonably to highly productive land. Right now, it's got to be moving by surface. Unlike other places like Ontario, where subsurface drainage, tile drainage is prevalent and really dominant, here historically, at least north of the 49th parallel, surface drainage has been the dominant means by which excess moisture has been addressed.
And I think when you look at that, many of us have driven across the prairies and seen this exact picture, and needing to realize that that surface water is going to get to that ditch no matter what, and that farm gentleman or the producer is going to make sure that happens. And I think that says it all right there in that picture.
So now it's a question of, is the farmer better off doing it this way, striking a gully through the land, or is there another option that's more expensive, more sophisticated, but may in fact do a better job, and that's subsurface drainage, pending a whole lot of site-specific, farm-specific details. So a quick refresher for those who did not take part in the first two webinars. What is subsurface or tile drainage meant to address? It's the excess moisture in the root zone. The intent of the farmer and those supporting the farmer is to remove the water stress from the root zone and the root zone only. That's a function of the depth at which the tile is placed. And so once the water table reaches the tile and below, then the tile is no longer coming into play. And so that's just something to keep in mind in terms of what is the impact that tile can have. And Bruce Schufelt, the Manitoba engineer, spoke during the first two webinars. He dealt with a lot of the technical details associated with planning, designing, and executing tile drainage. Again, as a quick refresher, I believe this is a figure that Bruce did not use, so I'll give you a different view here. And this is, again, to focus on some of the fundamentals of tile design, and the key concept there is you see the capital D referring to the depth of the tile. If the depth is increased, then so too can the spacing between the tiles be increased. But if the depth is decreased, if the tiles are shallower, then they have to be tighter in order to achieve the same intensity of drainage. So some of these technical details do become relevant when examining the potential environmental implications of tile drainage. So there's a quick refresher for you all. Further to keeping this into a broader context, in our extension, folks like myself, we have to, of course, speak to farmers appropriately, recognizing and saying openly that we realize your farms are all individual. The way you manage, plus your soil and landscape conditions across a varied province and Great Plains region like we have, mean that it should be a customized approach. And yes, that's what we want to keep in mind as well when we're looking at the potential environmental impact or benefits of tile drainage.
And when you're talking about the benefits need to be able to pay themselves back. So tile drainage like that is not going to work for everybody in every location.
That's correct. And even though I'll be highlighting some research results later, John Carney will certainly emphasize this, that we do have some solid knowledge now, but on the environmental implications. But of course, we have to consider with one or two research sites, we haven't necessarily covered all the bases in Agri-Manitoba and the Great Plains region. So a little bit further context before I pass it over to John. Things appear to be heating up overall, and they seem to be getting wetter. So notwithstanding local variations, yes, of course, it's a big place. I'm not saying this applies everywhere every year, but we are very interested in how water flows are either consistent with averages or different from them. This is a hydrograph, for example, for the Red River at Emerson for what was a pretty wacky year. 2005, as you can see from the red curve, featured two peaks. Not just when we typically see the peak for runoff for daily discharge in the early part of the growing season, really before much of anything's growing, but also a peak during the middle of the growing season. when we had stranded cows and we were struggling to feed them. And the average is indicated by the green line. By contrast, 2009, a more normal year, as you can see, the main peak matching roughly the green average, the red one indicating the daily discharge peak for the Red River in 2009. So we need to look at some of these examples to be able to put into context any given situation and ask ourselves, what can farmers reasonably manage for, and society at large, as we tackle these water management challenges. And we need to understand the mechanisms that are dominant and subdominant, explaining how the water appears on the landscape and starts moving at what time of year.
And I think when we look at that graph, we expect that to be like the normal, but we're all realizing the normal isn't what's out there anymore. And we're seeing more variances more often, and whether you believe that to be climate change, I think we could all agree that there is change, and we're seeing more of the intensity more often now.
Yeah. So in thinking of our hydrological profile, fancy way of saying how does water appear and move on our lands in Agri-Manitoba and the Great Plains region, to date, the dominant mechanism has been spring snowmelt, as depicted in the photo here. You can see Riding Mountain in the background, and so topography a little more relevant there than in the Red River Valley. But regardless of the slope of the land, and in fact, even without slope, we see the water management challenge that come with it and the need for farmer drainage, is that when it's happening at that time of year, we don't have a crop growing, for instance, to utilize nutrients or to sop up water. And so we have to certainly recognize that it's been the history of water flow and potentially explains how Lake Winnipeg has come to have water quality problems. And as well, in terms of water quantity management, we have to keep this in mind. Again, notwithstanding what potential changes could come, as Steve was alluding to, in terms of how farmers install technologies like tile on their individual farms. So with that, it's time for a pause. And that pause is a poll question, the first of the afternoon. And I'll now read it out and invite Jackie to fire up the polling machine. The question is, the field shown on the previous slide has been tiled. The field shown on the previous slide has been tiled. True or false? Water is flowing through the tile.
And I see the polls open. Thank you, Jackie. Maybe a little more verbal communication today. So
I'm back online. I hope you can hear me.
Oh, we can, Jackie. It's so nice to hear your voice.
Yes,
oh, glad to be here finally.
So for all of you listening, that's the lovely Jackie, who is always there to help us out.
Well, didn't work very well today, but we're here.
Well, we're here. You're doing a good job.
All right, so it's a true-false question. Presumably, most that are going to reply have already rolled a die? No, I flipped a coin.
Push the button. How are we doing there, Jackie?
Okay, we've got about 65% voted, so I'll close the poll now.
That's a pretty good response rate. Thanks, folks.
And here's the results. We had 91% false and 9% true.
Okay, that's good to hear. Yes, the premise being that if there's sufficient frost in the ground, then the water cannot flow through the tiles at that time of year. So the answer is false. Granted, this year we had maybe some strange conditions heading into winter. Maybe the depth of frost not as serious this year, not as dramatic, but that speaks to individual circumstances year to year. All right, so thinking more about hydrology and how the water moves on the land, it's important to speak to Manitoba growers, in my case, regarding local conditions, but I do like to draw from experience and expertise and knowledge elsewhere. So here's an example. Discovery Farms is a farmer-led water quality research and education endeavor south of the border. It's operating in Minnesota and Wisconsin with a number of monitoring sites. And these locations are examining water flow via either the surface or subsurface through tile. So I simply wish to preface our discussion of Manitoba-specific research, what we've learned here so far, and what we want to think about in terms of advising farmers in the future want to provide some context with what's been learned elsewhere. And sometimes a contrast is important, so let's look at Wisconsin. You can see that red circle and the hashed blue bars, light blue bars. You can see that Wisconsin is plenty different than Minnesota and certainly Manitoba in that there is significant tile flow at a time of year when, presumably, we're thinking more about sleigh bells and putting gifts under the tree.
Wishing we were at that time.
Yeah. And so, interesting to see that, in fact, tile drainage is the dominant mechanism, although there's quite a bit of variability there. But as you can see from the graphs on the left, the flow through the tile is actually dominant over surface flows in the Discovery Farm locations. Another key message here, this may be obvious, nonetheless, sometimes it's important to point out the obvious. If it rains more, then there will be more flow through the tiles. So can farmers control the weather? No. And of course, that's kind of the point. If it rains more, then water has to be removed from the land in order to reduce the water stress on the crop. And that has potential implications, obviously, but this is the nature of the beast. So in light of that, something that will come up a couple of times this afternoon, can we consider enhanced levels of management when it comes to tile drainage? There are options. As you can see on the left, that's an inline option, something that Bruce Schufelt alluded to last week. You can see the boxy kind of control structures on the right, and this is what is referred to as controlled drainage. These are controlled structures that, if they can be justified in terms of cost and complexity, they can be added to a tile system design. And as you can see from that second illustration, it's the adjustment of the height of the water in the control box that determines how much water is or is not held back in the field versus allowed to discharge. Whereas with free drainage, the water would simply flow through the tiles. So we have to ask ourselves, does it have a fit here? We have to be cautious about seeing a potential BMP or beneficial management practice from elsewhere. We have to look critically at all the aspects to determine whether or not it is suitable to our climate, soil, landscape, and farming context.
Well, we think important here, it has the ability to be managed. And as we're looking at tile drainage and giving consideration on where it could be utilized, the idea of management is certainly going to be part of the conversation. So,
undoubtedly, Steve. So a bit further to that, in light of mentioning controlled drainage here, you can see conventional or free drainage versus controlled in Ohio. And I don't wish to dwell on the details here. This is mainly for context, again, to see that controlled drainage has a real fit. It's understandable that it would be discussed heavily, especially south of the border where winter isn't so prevalent in a place like Ohio, because there's quite a bit of flow outside of the growing season. That isn't necessarily the case here, right? Barring change in our circumstances. Now, there may be an agronomic reason to consider controlled drainage. We'll touch on that later. But this is important to take knowledge from elsewhere and be cautious about applying it here. And actually, here's my reference, John. Water use by the plants. And of course, this was well explained by Bruce. You can see over the course of the growing season there, there's a high level of water. Early on, it drops if there's tile in the ground, and then it can rise again with the addition of water through rainfall. But the crop actually, as well as the tile, is responsible for the drawdown of the water table once we're into the heat of the growing season, so to speak. The crop is growing vigorously, temperatures are warmer, and evapotranspiration is partly explaining that. So why do I bring this up now? It's because this is one possible justification for controlled drainage in our region, which is a water deficit region. When the math is done, there really isn't enough water here, and farmers have experienced this excess water in the spring, drought later in the growing season. Maybe there's a fit for controlled drainage here, to be determined. A quick acknowledgement of some work in Ontario that helps to illustrate how, and this will come into play later in the presentation, folks, how the introduction of controlled drainage, and Bruce did allude to this last week, how that alters the ratio of water flowing overland, which is business as usual, versus the tile. So by introducing tile drainage, that now we have a ratio, right? Otherwise the premise is it was all flowing over the surface. And then by further adding controlled drainage, you can see how that has implications for that split. And that will have implications later when we're examining the fate of nutrients, for instance, on a fertilized field. And back to volumes. Is it just about volumes, or is it also about timing? And again, not to reiterate too much what Bruce mentioned last week, but part of the premise is that storage space is created by a well-designed and operated tile drainage system. There's now a split between infiltration and surface runoff, and that has the potential to diminish peak flows. It provides a buffer effect. And I bring that up again because this has implications for environmental impact, be it nutrient fate or total flows of water that we need to keep in mind as we move along. But before we move along, we've arrived at poll question number 2. So as Jackie opens the poll for those interested to participate, I'll rattle off the question. The dominant mechanism triggering surface runoff in much of the Great Plains region has historically been A, steady spring rains, B, summer thunder boomers, C, frequent February thaws, D, reliable spring snowmelts, or E, surprising September storms. As you can see, John Carney, I conform to the classic question construction method as I was trained to do for some of our formal training exercises with agronomists. Yeah, try to keep them all balanced so there are no giveaways.
And there's no F. There's no all of the above. So you've got to pick one.
So this one's a bit more complicated. We'll give it a few more seconds before Jackie closes the poll. And I should ask first, Jackie, what's the level of response?
We've got about 63% right now.
Okay, that sounds about the same as the first time. So we'll give it a few more seconds, but I suspect it's probably the same hardcore, keener 63%.
Well, we're up to
70 last week here. We got to keep those numbers up.
We're up to 66 now, so I'll close it now.
Good cheerleading.
Yeah, go team, go! Come on. Let's cheer them on.
All right. If it doesn't look like we'll reach 70, we'll accept what we get.
All right, we had 67% here, so 18% said steady spring rains, 2% said summer thunder boomers, and 80% said reliable spring snowmelts. Okay, good to hear. Yes, D is the correct answer. We can debate my choice of words, but hopefully I was reasonably clear. Yeah, the dominant mechanism historically for triggering surface runoff here is reliable spring snowmelt.
Spring melt.
Yes.
And we're all wishing it was here now.
And with that, we move on to part 2, and this is where I introduce John Carney.
Oh, good to be here today. Thank you.
Yes, so if there's any concern with the audio there, John's using a speaker here in the room, so let us know if there's a problem there, Jackie, or anyone else out there in webinar land who's got my mobile number. John Carney is the Executive Director of the Manitoba Livestock Manure Management Initiative, and he is here today to provide an overview of the outcomes of a couple of literature reviews. So, John, take it away.
Yeah, welcome, John.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Mitch. A little bit of background on MLMMI. Since 1998, we've been doing research in all manner of questions involving manure management in Manitoba. And so when there were a number of questions about manure management on tile-drained lands last year, we saw an opportunity to help find some of the answers. So we launched an RFP for a literature review. The reason we did a literature review is obviously tile drainage is a well-established practice throughout North America and has certainly been used in Manitoba for a number of years. So we wanted to see what was the state of knowledge out there in terms of practices and learnings that when we passed it through the filter of what makes Manitoba unique, we could see how could we learn from the experience of others as opposed to trying to reinvent the wheel. So I'm happy to say there was strong interest in our RFP. we actually ended up proceeding with 2 groups, one from the University of Manitoba, one from Stantec and PBS. In fact, Bruce, who was on the first 2 webinars, was part of the Stantec PBS group. And I'd like to thank our researchers for their time. I know this is a technical area, and I know they put a lot of work into their literature reviews. They're both posted online, manure.gov.ca, the Manitoba Livestock Manure Management website. Actually, it's manure.mb.ca, sorry about that. And I think they put a lot of work into this, and there's a lot of good information in these reports. So I'm just going to hit some highlights today. I certainly won't cover it all. So in terms of addressing what's in their reports, I've chosen to break it into 3 sections, soil management, nutrient management, and water management. So starting off with soil management, let's maybe do a little bit of a refresher in terms of some things that Bruce talked about last week, and in fact I think Mitchell might have mentioned earlier today. And so macropores, no surprise, I'm sure you guys are remembering about macropores, and what you'll recall from the last webinar was you learned about matrix flow versus preferential flow. So matrix flow is the good stuff where the water is infiltrating through the soil, the nutrients, the sediments are getting trapped and staying within the soil profile, which is ideal. Preferential flow is where macropores are providing a channel or a conduit for water that can actually move directly from the surface through to the tiles. And so as the screen is showing, the macropores are on the left, illustrated in this case by a soil crack. It could have been an earthworm burrow. It could have been a root canal by a root, but in this case it's just we're showing a crack. And you can see that it's possible for manure applied on the surface to get washed into the tile through a rain event. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. So in terms of beneficial management practices to deal with this, so some things would be that producers wouldn't be encouraged to apply manure when the soil profile is saturated. So if the soils are saturated, that's not a good time to be applying manure on a tile-drained field. Pre-tillage can help to break up those macropores and disrupt that flow. And Mitchell's provided a nice illustration here of pre-till, and maybe I'll just ask Mitchell to comment on that.
Sure. Tillage equipment does vary, and that means we've got to be careful when we refer to tillage in terms of breaking up these macropores without some specifics. But here's an example of what's a pretty typical implement. And so the caution is regarding the details in terms of soil type, the depth of that tillage path. There's some details there that we in the scientific community needs to sort through, but in principle, this appears to be a logical step in mitigating risk associated with manure applied to a tile-drained field.
Thanks, Mitch. And I know Mitchell mentioned soil type, and so for instance, a clay-type soil would be more prone to those cracks that you see when the soil dries out in the summer, which would be a macropore. Certainly there's some questions about tillage in terms of how should we define good tillage practices. Things that come into play are, well, what depth should we till to? What implement or tool should we use? How does soil type come into it? So there's a number of different questions that we need more knowledge in order to do the best possible job of this pre-tillage in terms of protecting the nutrients and not allowing them to flow into the tiles. The second area that we are going to talk about briefly is nutrient management. And fortunately, there's a great model that the fertilizer industry has used, the 4 R's, and this provides a great platform for me to recap what's in our report. So the first of the 4 R's is the right source. And so when we talk about source and nutrients in manure, it's important to remember that all manures are not created the same. And so we've got solid manures versus liquid manures. We've got manures from different species of livestock, and they have considerably different nutrient contents. And so it's dangerous just to talk about manure as a simple, singular topic. There's a lot of variation and complexity into it, and that brings us into the second R, right rate. Because there's different nutrient levels in those manures, producers are regularly testing the manure content, testing their soils to know what is the right rate to apply to meet the crop's needs, and then often supplementing those nutrients with commercial fertilizer to get the right nutrient level for the crops that they're producing. The third R is the right time, and we've already referred to that in terms of applying manure on tile drain lands. You certainly don't want to do it when the soil is saturated. You don't want to do it when the tile drain is running, and you don't want to do it when a big rain event is forecasted. So that would be the right time. And then in terms of the right place, and we've got a picture of your typical Manitoba liquid manure process, which is injection. And I'm happy to tell you that Manitoba is a world leader in terms of the uptake of injection. We do tremendous volume of injection in this province, and frankly, it's a great management practice because for a couple of reasons in terms of this context. By injecting it, you're inserting it and preserving it in the soil where you want it, and also the implements that do the injecting actually do some breaking up of the soils and could actually break up some of those macropores. And so there's a couple positives that come out of injection. So that concludes that section.
And yes, just to break this up like a macropore, John, we're going to break up your slides.
There you go.
Hopefully. Yeah. With poll question number 3 regarding the 4 R's of 4R nutrient stewardship. And the challenge to you folks out there is to determine what exactly are the 4 R's from this list. Are they A, right fertilizer, right soil, right landscape, right region? B, reduce, reuse, recycle, repeat. C, regulate, 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 regulate. Or D, right fertilizer, right field, right farm, right frequency. And your last choice is right source at the right rate, right time, and right place. A pretty complicated question in terms of options, Steve. However,
we're going to give you a second to figure it out and give us the right answer.
Yeah.
So get on those polls. Come on, people. We want that higher number.
The answer was the answer was on your screen for quite a length of time as John was describing how the 4 R's pertain to manure management and tile drainage. So presumably, Jackie, we don't have to leave it open for very much longer. What's the level of response so far?
No, we've got about 74% voted, so I will close the poll.
Way to go, people. Thank you. Some of you guys must have come in from shoveling that snow.
Yes, seeking shelter and grabbing a learning opportunity.
We're all better looking than you.
Yeah, that's right.
Listening to.
We must look great right now.
Yeah. Forgot to tell you, all have hats and sunglasses.
All right, so we have the results up on the screen here. We have 89% of the people voted the last choice, right source at the right rate, time, and place.
Excellent. Thank you, Jackie.
Way to go, guys. Thank you.
Great.
Alrighty, back to you, John, with the third category of practice that was addressed in the literature reviews.
Water management.
Water management, very good. So we'll just advance that one more, Mitchell, and we'll get into talking a little bit about system design. So when you're installing tile and you're contemplating design, so you start with a concept of what are you trying to accomplish in terms of providing drainage for that particular area. So, you know, we can see the tile drainage equipment off to the left. And so, you know, one of the first questions we've got to ask ourselves is, where is this water going to go? So that's illustrated in this slide as the outlet. Because we need to have a place for the water to go. And then in terms of design considerations, we'll look at the contour of the land and determine the soil types, the crops we're growing, and that will help us come up with the overall design. But I think something very important, this is a great time to stop and think about your future needs, because typically when you tile a field, it's a major investment that will serve your needs for the next 30, 40, perhaps 50 years. And so when you're looking at that kind of an investment and planning horizon, it's important to think ahead about, well, what conditions is my field and my crops going to be facing 20, 30, 40 years from now? And while nobody knows with absolute certainty what the answer is, I think what we can say is it's likely going to change. And so I would say a BMP is to build flexibility into your design and into your system so that you aren't painting yourself into a corner, so to speak, and if something changes, that your options are limited. And then carrying on with water management, we're back to control structures. And Mitchell's talked quite a bit about this, which is great. And frankly, I think we need more research here in Manitoba in terms of the applicability and how it fits here. I like that last question. Does it fit here? That's a great question, and I think we need more answers in understanding does it make sense here. And then just to kind of round this out, in terms of some rhetorical questions, first of all, hopefully you've seen that there's enough variation between fields, soils, manure types, crops, that you can see that there is the difficulty with trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution here. You know, what do we need to have in order to build our confidence in these techniques and technologies? We've talked about a lot of things over the last 3 seminars or webinars. What information do we need? And then finally, what steps will we take together to get to a point where BMPs can readily be adopted? And so I think the last thing I'd like to close off on is just a reflection that as much as we've talked about the risks of manure going through macropores and nutrients going where we don't want them to go, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that in fact there's a lot of positives that tile drainage bring to keeping your nutrients where you want them and making sure they get into the crops and they're not lost. For instance, I think the worst case scenario for nutrient loss is a crop that's drowned out, where you supply the nutrients in the field, there's a major water event, there's a crop loss, and we've seen it happen time and time again in this province, unfortunately. But that is probably the worst scenario in terms of nutrient loss, nutrients going where you don't want them to go.
Big wash.
Yeah. Another aspect of tile drainage that really helps us with nutrient management is Bruce showed us how tile can reduce the variation in crop yield from year to year. And so when you've got less variation, then that means as a producer, you are better able to dial in the nutrient needs that need to be in the soil for the crop in the coming year, because some of the peaks and valleys are mitigated through better water management tools. And then finally, when yields go up, frankly, and which is the name of the game in agriculture, but that evapotranspiration that we've talked about, where good crops, good husbandry of the crops, coupled with the right water, right amount of moisture at the right time, and the nutrients in the right place, develop bigger yields. And so when you take those factors into consideration, there's a lot to be said that tile does have a number of beneficial management practices, aspects to the practice itself.
Well, there's no doubt, John, we're better off to keep the nutrients in the ground than we are having it wash out into the drain.
Yep.
Oh, number 4.
Excellent wrap up there, John. And with that, we move on to poll question number 4. Which of the following scenarios appears to pose the most concern with respect to manure application on tile drain fields? So you may suggest that there's lots debatable about this, but I think John gave you a hint. If we could narrow it today, we would say the most concern is associated with either A, preferential flow via macropores, B, diffusion through water-filled pores, C, rapid leaching in shrink swell clays, D, overland flow on steep slopes, or E, broadcast of the manure without incorporation. The poll is now open, I see. We'll give it another 5 or 10 seconds and then ask Jackie for a status update.
Right now we're at about 50%, so.
Okay, well, we'll wait a few more seconds.
It is a more challenging question.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry if I put the audience to sleep.
No, I don't think you put them to
No,
sleep.
I think
We're testing them now.
These all sound plausible. What
Yeah.
attorney?
Yeah, remember, if you want a star on top of your paper, you got to answer this question. How we doing there, Jackie?
We're just over 60% now.
Come on, guys. Get in there.
All right, we'll give it a few more seconds.
Looks like we're staying.
I guess we need an F for that that for the die to work, right?
Yeah.
With 1 to 6 being options. I'll have to think about that next time.
Okay, Jackie, we're good?
Okay, we're
Yeah, let's
63%, so I'll close the poll. All right, so it looks like 78% answered preferential flow via macropores, sorry.
Good.
Awesome.
Good to hear. Yes,
Yeah.
that, at least to the moment, right, John, is
Yeah.
where we're focusing our attention, at least in terms of this list. And
Yeah.
there are a few distractors there that that were meant to challenge the audience. All right. With that, thanks to John for the synopsis of the literature review outcomes.
Very grateful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's move on to part 3, and that's the home stretch, folks, where I'm going to give you a view of some Manitoba research results in terms of field study here in Manitoba and looking at the big picture of water management, segueing to some take-home messages. So first with, again, some hydrology context. This and several of these figures are courtesy of a University of Manitoba report about a subject I'm going to focus on here shortly with respect to water management. And you can see that in general, the western side of the province, associated with the escarpment, the Manitoba escarpment being the dividing line, is primarily dominated by quote-unquote natural runoff. There are manipulations for sure in that stream network, but it's quite a bit different when we move down from the escarpment into the Red River Valley and everything east of the escarpment, where now it's artificial surface drainage that's dominating. So that's just a bit of context in terms of thinking what farmers can and can't do. The suitability of tile is generally matched up with poorly to imperfectly drained soils, as you can see in that illustration, something that Bruce highlighted during the previous 2 webinars. And the link I'm drawing here is to water management in general. And that is going to be addressed here as I share some preliminary results from the U of M studies of the potential for water retention or detention. So this is where we start to see connections between tile and a more comprehensive or overall water management strategy for Manitoba and the Great Plains region, and alluding to the Premier's announcement at Ag Days, thinking about holding back water actually and not just shooting it downstream. And that's what that figure on the left indicates. Red in this case is good. It means that all 6 criteria, suitability criteria that were used to examine land in Agri-Manitoba by the U of M researchers for suitability for water retention, all 6 criteria are met where you see red. So that just means, such as in the parts of the Red River Valley, there is opportunity for achieving water retention and achieving goals with respect to, for instance, Lake Winnipeg and water quality. But before we get into the science, let's think about what is an apple versus apple comparison versus the old cliche of apple orange. So I've provided a few comparisons on the screen here, and I'm challenging everyone to think, ask yourselves, are any of these correct comparisons? For instance, the feeding of cattle out on the land rather than in the yard with intact bales or maybe swaths, what's called swath grazing, bale grazing commonly. Maybe it's with standing corn grazing. Well, we can attribute some environmental impacts to that practice, but we have to ask ourselves, is the comparison of extensive wintering versus no cattle? No. Unless the province shuts down this farm or the entire beef sector of the livestock industry, that's not a valid comparison. The comparison should be the cattle on the land versus any impact when they're kept in the yard.
I don't think McDonald's would like that.
No, not in the near term, that's for sure. That would definitely shake up the McDonald's economic model, yeah. So let's move on to the second comparison. Is pig manure versus no manure, John Carney, a valid comparison? You can probably guess what I'm alluding to here, a certain heavy restriction on one sector of the livestock industry not too long ago.
Yeah, well, certainly when we look at all the economic benefits of the hog industry to this province is huge, whether you're talking about jobs as veterinarians, transport drivers, feed mills, processing on the farms themselves. And so, trying to imagine an economically sustainable Manitoba without a hog industry, I just can't imagine it.
Yeah, from the water quality standpoint, what I'm getting at here is a molecule of phosphorus, for instance, for pig manure versus dairy manure, poultry manure, or commercial fertilizer. All of those phosphorus molecules pose the same risk ultimately to Lake Winnipeg or Lake Dauphin or Clarny Lake.
Yeah.
And so I guess you know where this is going. None of those are valid comparisons, and I'm using the others as parallel stories to what we're getting at here with nutrients appearing in tile water. We can collect samples from tiles and find nutrients, but the comparison is not against no water leaving farmland because, as I mentioned earlier, presumably the water is moving by some other means, and that's predominantly through surface drainage. So if an impact is already happening, we have to ask ourselves, with the introduction of tile drainage, again, has to be properly designed and targeted and so forth, is there a potential net benefit in terms of, for instance, nutrient escape from agricultural land to surface waters?
Well, like it said, it's going to happen. So what's the better way, or is there a better way?
That's right. And so that segues into my brief overview of some preliminary results of made in Manitoba research done along number 2 highway near Culross, best described as a 1 or 2 horse town. There's an elevator there and a few houses, not much else. The farm in question is just north from there on number 2 highway. It features a clay soil where tile was installed, and water does flow through the tile. So similar to the story about Kelburn Farm south of Winnipeg in the Red River Valley, yes, tile can work on clays. It just comes down to the detail. But in this case, what was particularly interesting was that the farmer couldn't rely on the local surface drainage network to get rid of the water. So in collaboration with the Salle Redboine Conservation District,
there's a plug for you, Justin.
Yes, Justin, I hope you're listening. Justin Reed out there in Holland. Yes, a collection pond was established and a retention pond whereby the water would not be sent immediately downstream. It would go into these structures in the corner of the field so that the excess moisture problem in the annual crop field would be addressed and the water had a place to go. It's just not conventional for it to be staying on that same property.
And Justin will give you more of a rundown tomorrow when he's doing part of his presentation.
Or maybe next week, right?
Oh, next week. Yeah, I said tomorrow. Sorry. It's been a long day,
That's
hey,
all right.
Technical difficulties, people.
Yes. All right. So here is a quick overview of what happens on this site. Water is sent by the tile into the collection pond, which is fairly small. Then it's pumped as needed into the retention pond. However, some water does flow yet by the surface drains within the farmer's field, and then ultimately, of course, by the ditch. So the researchers at the U of M, in collaboration with U of Waterloo research team, are examining water flows and nutrient fate on this site. And this relates to conversation happening more and more south of the border, and that is the notion of retaining water, cycling it back on the land for utilization with benefits to the farmer and to greater society, because the premise is then it's a closed loop system and the nutrients would stay on the land. Is this necessarily easy for the farmer to adopt? Affordable? Is it entirely scientifically validated? Not necessarily. That's where the caution comes into play, as we'll mention again later. So let's dive into a little bit of nerdy content here. Bear with me, folks, as I present first on the monitoring of phosphorus movement in this system at this Culross farm in the year 2015. So looking specifically at phosphorus, you'll see 2 graphs on the left. They are at the top for dissolved reactive phosphorus and total phosphorus on the bottom. So on the bottom, that would be is a summation of what's hidden in the water in the dissolved or soluble form, and as well the type of phosphorus that's stuck onto soil particles or particulate phosphorus. So regardless of which graph you look at, you can see that there is a trend that's quite obvious for this major spring event, as in a storm in mid-May, and that is that, look at the tile, which is the green line, it is not showing much in the way of concentration of phosphorus, either dissolved or total. And in contrast to that, what is the culprit? It seems for a mid-May storm, in terms of transport of phosphorus, it's the surface water flows within the farmer's field that ultimately connect to the ditch. So this is in keeping, actually, with what we would expect. Phosphorus tends to move laterally along the surface, doesn't tend to move down through the soil to potentially reach tiles if they exist in a field. And so that's for mid-May. One may ask, well, what exactly is it like in mid-May to do research in Manitoba? Well, it can require both a toque and a canoe.
Yeah, there you go.
And
Are you in there?
No, that is not me in the canoe. I prefer to wait, if I'm going to ride in a canoe, until much more reasonable time of year. I did offer to check out the site, but not at that time of year. And luckily, these researchers were bold enough to collect their samples, make sure the equipment's working. As you can see on the left and the bottom surface flows, there's a weir there that's monitoring the level of water going through from the surface flow into the ditch. And so with that in mind, you can see the snow on the ground. It's quite striking to think about how it's a transitional period, right? Is it winter? Is it spring? Well, the snow has melted. There's water moving. But how much can we expect the tile to come into play here, and thinking about what is the dominant means by which something like phosphorus can be transported.
So you took those pictures, right? You were the guy on the hydraulic.
Right, of course.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure.
Yes,
You
yes.
know how this works.
In my rubber boots up on the gravel, just in case they needed my help. But yeah, somebody had to be the photographer. All right, so let's now move on from mid-May to presumably when we won't see any snow on the ground, and that's a summer storm event in middle to late July. Have the circumstances changed? Yes, in terms of temperature and maybe moisture content of the soil, and the crop is now growing. And similarly, we ask, well, has the story changed for phosphorus loss? And it has to some degree. If we look in either graph for the green line, which indicates the tile, the concentration of phosphorus in the tile is down near zero. And a couple of the other surface flows are joining tile there at the low concentrations as well. But there is one curve, one of those surface water flows in the field that remains elevated. So even in July, even when we don't tend to see much runoff, you can see that in 2015, which I'm told was similar in what results were observed in 2016 at this research site, it seems that even in July, the surface flow is the culprit in terms of phosphorus movement, which is largely in keeping with what we would expect according to general soil science principles. Now, a stickler like Steve may ask, hey, but Mitch, you tell me about nitrogen being highly water soluble, tends to move down through the soil. Now with tile, can we expect some to challenge and say, are we swapping one problem for another?
I didn't even get to answer
Valid
the
question.
Yeah, thank you.
So valid
One-man show here.
Valid question, Steve. So let's see if we are trading one problem for another, from phosphorus to nitrogen. Knowing that it tends to behave differently, let's look at the graphs for, at the top, inorganic nitrogen as nitrite or nitrate. So this is highly water soluble. It's the kind that's picked up by a soil test, for instance, to advise the farmer how much nitrogen fertilizer to apply. That's nitrate. And then total nitrogen is at the bottom. And you can see for a spring event, mid-May, the pattern's pretty similar for both inorganic and total nitrogen, that yes, there is some nitrate detected in the tile, but lo and behold, in mid-May, the surface flows are still heavily involved and responsible for more nitrate loss, higher concentrations at least, than the tile. And so this is a bit surprising in light of what we would expect nitrogen to do, being highly water soluble, tends to leach down through the soil profile. But as you saw from the pictures earlier, this is a transitional period. Could be a lot of excess moisture in the ground already. How readily is it able to move down? The whole system's just pretty darn wet. So now let's contrast a major spring event in mid-May to a major summer event. Now the crop is growing, it's hot, it's mid to late July. Are the results different? And yes, they are. Look at how much higher the concentration is for nitrate, nitrite, as well as total N in the tile, the green line, as opposed to the surface flows. Now, the surface flows aren't entirely at zero. And the other thing we have to ask is how much water is actually flowing at this time of year. These are concentrations, folks. So as I'm going to explain momentarily, that's only one part of the story. We have to ask ourselves how much water is actually leaving by the tile that contains that elevated level of nitrogen, which is a concern. And this is my best attempt to be a water nerd, a water scientist, to explain the two main concepts, they being concentration, as in using regular language, how dirty is the water, versus load, which is how much bad stuff in total is going downstream with a bunch of, in my illustration here, jars of water. We have a whole lot of jars containing not much bad stuff. Does it ultimately lead to a problem? And yes, that's why the scientists are interested in both concentration and load. So that's a caution in terms of the results I'm showing today. Those are concentrations, not loads. So that's not the entire story. We have to have a sense of how much water is leaving a site like this to know what is the potential impact of the elevated phosphorus or nitrogen levels. So I'll allude to that momentarily. And here's the overview. Again, focusing on phosphorus for this entire system now. Let's look at overland flow, which is on the left-hand side with the ditch, in terms of concentrations of dissolved reactive phosphorus. This is phosphorus that we can't see in the water. It's dissolved or soluble inside of it, versus groundwater, that's GW in the middle, and then the surface element, which is also the pond, and then finally the tile. So we know the pond actually is surface water, but that's because we can see it. It's actually tile water going into that collection and retention pond at this site. So keep that in mind when we look at ditch and overland flow on the left. There's quite a bit of variability, but we generally see higher values for dissolved phosphorus than in either groundwater or especially the pond and the tile. So what can we conclude from this? Granted, one site, 1 year of data, 2016 similar, with all the appropriate cautions, tile drainage could be a BMP for phosphorus. Are we trading it for a nitrogen problem? Sure, we care about nitrogen. We need to have the full picture here, which is what I'm going to allude to here momentarily. So, in quick summary here, no more numbers, just symbols. As you can see from the check marks, the outflow, along the surface within the farmer's field, that gets the sizable yellow check. The big red check mark is in reference to the ditch, because the results so far are indicating the real action is in the ditch. And for you municipal councillors out there, as well as the farmers, it's something we need to think more and more about, managing the ditches. That's where a lot of the nutrient mobilization and transport is apparently actually happening, much less so in the collection pond, which is, on this site, responsible for the tile water. That's the destination for the tile water. So this is my advertisement for properly designed research. You need to keep in mind the big picture. Where are these nutrients intended to go?
Right to the crops.
That's exactly right, Steve. That's the farmer's interest. And for the most part, farmers are quite successful, scoring very high on the mass test based on our numbers for what's in the field, in the crop, versus ending up in water. We're talking 99% more or less for a lot of our nitrogen and phosphorus estimates. Very good scores, but it doesn't take much escaping in the water to do harm. That's why, of course, farmers and the rest of us are interested. We need to study the whole system. Just collecting a sample of tile water isn't enough.
That is correct.
We find nutrients. Of course, it looks bad, but hey, what about the proper comparison?
We got to remember, it's a business for the farmers as well. So their nutrients that they're spending lots of money on, they want to keep it into the crops. They don't want to go down the ditches.
Exactly right. So the key take-home is what appears to be the conclusion. So far, the preliminary numbers indicate over 80% of the runoff is still via surface flows. That means under 20% by the tile. So even though there are nutrients in the tile, most of the nutrients are still leaving via surface flow. That means we've got to focus on capturing and managing that runoff if we can.
So we realize it's 4 o'clock, and we realize that we're going to probably be losing a few of you soon, so we will try to wrap it up as fast as we can.
Here's a quick comparison to what was shown last week by Bruce, and you can see that the numbers are similar to what I just quoted for the Culross site, that under 30% is typically observed in the Red River Valley for movement of water through the tiles. We do have some commonality with results from elsewhere in the region. And further to confirming our fate of nitrogen versus phosphorus, here you can see back to the discovery farms in Minnesota and Wisconsin, most of the flow by a tile, and yet most of the phosphorus by dissolved in particulate via surface runoff as opposed to tile drainage, whereas the nitrogen tends to move mostly with the tile. And so, of course, more flow through the tile with more rain means more nitrogen loss, but as with phosphorus, what's the key message to farmers? Manage how much is in the soil to manage the risk. However, the more it rains, the more drainage to the tiles, the more nitrogen loss. This is something we have to accept and try to mitigate, but we have to keep in mind proper comparisons. Here's an example of results from the Kelburn farm, as Bruce was describing last week. 2 spacings looking at phosphorus loss with respect to tile. What's missing from that comparison, Steve?
The nitrogen loss.
The nitrogen is part of it, you bet. And with respect to phosphorus, the surface flows as well, right? This is tile only. So I think I've driven that home.
Oh, you had to test me.
Plenty well, yeah. Just like Bruce is keeping me on my toes.
He's watching me write down something.
So here's a quick acknowledgement that there is another way. Not far up the highway on number 2, similar soil type. The farmer has grown several years of alfalfa to dry out the soil, address an excess moisture problem, but as Steve was alluding to earlier, John as well, farming's a business. We have to keep in mind that such a practice has to fit a farm's economic model. We can't expect farmers to do it. And that's why tile is another option.
So we're coming down to the end, and we're looking at poll question number 5.
Yes, according to general principles, nitrogen tends to move downward through soil, while phosphorus tends to move across the surface.
I see Jackie's opened up that poll.
Is that true or is that false?
All right, how we doing there, Jackie?
We've got over 60% right now, 65.
Wow. Thank you guys for hanging in there.
Oh,
Yeah.
great
For
show.
the sake of continuing to move it along, maybe you can give us our results, please.
All right, you bet.
Great show of endurance, everyone.
Yes,
All right, we have 85% true, 15 false.
Okay, very good. Yes,
Yeah,
the correct answer is true. General principles say that nitrogen tends to move vertically through the soil profile, whereas phosphorus tends to move across the surface. So with that, we're going to wrap with potential BMPs, as suggested last week, or listed, I should say, by Bruce Schufeld. A lot of the excitement over saturated buffers is south of the border with respect to nitrogen. Similar story, as you can see there, for constructed wetlands, as Bruce described. That could be reiterated for cover crops and the bioreactors. Potential benefits for phosphorus, but so far the emphasis has been nitrogen. So the caution is, how much can we expect farmers to adopt practices that aren't necessarily validated here? We have a different concern, primarily phosphorus and surface water, and we need to ensure that farmers can economically adopt these practices, or it's just not realistic for them to do so. So with that, I'll reiterate the take-home messages that I suggested you chew on during the webinar today. Agricultural drainage will happen one way or another, but to keep in mind proper comparisons before drawing conclusions, and being careful before taking the plunge, either the farmer with a practice or regulators or extension staff.
That's right.
So with that, another quick mention of the Premier's announcement at Ag Days. As you can see, some commonality with what we discussed today, so we can probably expect plenty of discussion down the line from our provincial government regarding addressing water quality and water quantity.
I believe your Minister Eichler, was out there with him when he made that announcement.
Yes. So with that, thanks very much to everyone for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much.
Participation and endurance. Please consider responding to the feedback questions.
Yes, please.
They will be sent your way via the webinar technology in the coming hours, I believe. And lastly, we have a poll question for you to respond to of a general feedback nature now. We'd like to get a sense of how much you learned today.
Are we helping you to get smarter?
That is it.
And as you guys are filling that poll question, we just want to say that it's important for you to tune in next week at 2:30 on Wednesday, where we won't have any technical difficulties. And the topic for webinar 4 will be policy and local government considerations. We're going to have a number of the conservation districts participating and talking about their areas and what's going on. And you can see that with the big red square that Mitch just threw up on the screen. So really encouraging you to stay tuned and pitch in and listen to the last of the 4 webinar series. We want to say that, you know what, tile drainage won't work everywhere. We're not saying that there won't be issues with tile drainage, but what we're saying is that under good water management practices, there's definitely a place for tile drainage. It can be something that can enhance the productivity of the fields and keep the nutrients out of the ditches. And as we're all focused on creating a healthier and nicer Lake Winnipeg, we need to work together. It is the partnership between ourselves, our farmers, our municipalities. Those are the things that are going to create success for all of us. So we're hoping that you stay tuned and pitch in and listen to webinar number 4. And please take a moment to fill out those last questions for us. And with that, I think we can say thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
My lovely assistant, or my co-worker, forgive me, my co-worker Allison, who's always behind the scenes working so hard on all this. Thank you very much, Allison. And of course, Mitch, and the lovely Vanna Jackie White there. Thank you, Jackie. We're very grateful.
Sorry about the technical issues today.
Not a problem. Things happen. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in.